At my husband's will reading, my son stood up in front of 27 relatives and shouted, "Selfish shrew! You don't deserve a single cent!" He tore a paper in front of everyone, trying to humiliate me. I simply handed a sealed envelope to the notary. He read it, and my daughter-in-law fainted. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Elaine, and at 62 years old, I thought I had experienced every possible humiliation life could offer. I was wrong." The mahogany conference room at Whitman & Associates felt suffocating that Tuesday morning. 27 family members had gathered for the reading of my late husband Robert's will, their faces a mixture of grief and barely concealed anticipation. The leather chairs creaked as people shifted, whispering among themselves about what they might inherit from the successful construction company Robert had built over 30 years. I sat in the front row, my hands folded in my lap, wearing the same black dress I'd worn to Robert's funeral 3 weeks earlier. My son Brian sat 2 seats away with his wife Jessica, both of them dressed expensively as always. Jessica's designer handbag probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and she made sure everyone noticed it sitting prominently on her lap. "Before we begin," Mr. Whitman announced, adjusting his glasses, "I want everyone to understand that this will was executed properly and witnessed according to state law." Brian leaned forward, his jaw tight with anticipation. At 38, he had Robert's broad shoulders, but none of his father's humility. Success had made him arrogant, and marriage to Jessica had made him cruel. The deceased, Robert James Morrison, leaves his entire estate, including Morrison Construction Company, the family home on Elm Street, and all financial assets totaling approximately $2.7 million. Mr. Whitman paused, scanning the room. To his beloved son, Brian Morrison. The room erupted in whispers. Several cousins and nephews who had hoped for smaller bequests looked disappointed but not surprised. Brian smiled smugly, reaching over to squeeze Jessica's manicured hand, but then Mr. Whitman continued reading, and my blood turned cold. However, there is a codicil attached, stating that Brian's inheritance is contingent upon him providing adequate care and respect for his mother, Elaine Morrison, for the remainder of her natural life. Brian's smile vanished. Jessica's face flushed red with anger. "What does that mean exactly?" Brian demanded, his voice sharp. "It means," Mr. Whitman explained carefully, "that if you fail to properly care for your mother or treat her with disrespect, the inheritance can be revoked and redistributed according to a secondary will." I felt the familiar knot forming in my stomach. Even in death, Robert was trying to force Brian to love me, to respect me. But forced love wasn't love at all. It was just another form of control. Brian stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. His face was purple with rage. "This is ridiculous. Dad's trying to control me from the grave." "Brian, please sit down," I whispered, mortified by the scene he was creating. "No, Mom!" He whirled to face me, his eyes blazing with fury. "This is your doing, isn't it? You manipulated him into this." 27 pairs of eyes turned to me. I felt heat creeping up my neck, the familiar shame I'd carried for years threatening to overwhelm me. "I had nothing to do with— Liar!" Brian's voice echoed off the walls. "You've been playing the victim for years, making Dad feel guilty about everything. Well, guess what? I'm not falling for it anymore." Jessica stood up beside him, her lips curved in a cruel smile. "We all know what this is really about," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Some people never learn to let go." "Brian, that's enough," Robert's brother Tom said firmly from the back of the room. But Brian wasn't finished. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "You want to know what I think of your little manipulation, Mom?" He waved the paper in the air. "This is what I think." Before I could react, he tore the paper in half, then in half again, letting the pieces flutter to the floor like fallen leaves. "Megera egoísta," he shouted, using the Spanish phrase Jessica's mother always used to describe women she didn't like. "You don't deserve a single cent. You never did anything but hold Dad back." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Jessica looked shocked by his outburst. My hands began to tremble and I pressed them together to stop the shaking. 38 years of raising this man, of sacrificing everything for him. And this was how he saw me. "That's quite enough, young man," Mr. Whitman said sternly. "This is a place of business, not a family therapy session." Brian laughed bitterly. Family? She stopped being family the day she decided to guilt-trip Dad into controlling my life from beyond the grave. I looked around the room at the faces of Robert's relatives. Some looked embarrassed for me, others seemed to enjoy the drama. But not one person defended me. Not one person told Brian he was wrong. The familiar feeling of invisibility washed over me. I had felt it so many times before, during family dinners when Brian would interrupt me mid-sentence, during holidays when Jessica would redirect every conversation away from me, during the years when I gradually became a ghost in my own home. But something was different this time. Instead of the usual crushing shame, I felt something else stirring in my chest, something I hadn't felt in years. Clarity. I reached into my purse and pulled out a sealed envelope. The paper was crisp and white, with "Private and Confidential" written in my careful handwriting across the front. I had been carrying it for 3 weeks, waiting for this moment. "Mr. Whitman," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I expected. "I have something for you." Brian scoffed. "Oh, what now? Another guilt trip?" I ignored him and walked to the front of the room, my heels clicking softly against the floor. Mr. Whitman took the envelope with raised eyebrows, his experienced fingers already working to open it. "This was given to me by Robert 2 days before he died," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "He told me to only give it to you if Brian ever showed his true character in public." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence was different. It was heavy with anticipation, not shame. Mr. Whitman's eyes widened as he read the contents. Then he looked up at me, then at Brian, then back at the papers in his hands. "Well," he said slowly, "this changes everything." Brian's face went white. Jessica grabbed his arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his sleeve. "What does it say?" Brian demanded, but his voice had lost its anger. Now it held something else, fear. I didn't wait to hear Mr. Whitman's response. I had been waiting 40 years to walk away from a room with my dignity intact, and I wasn't going to waste another second watching Brian's world crumble around him. Some truths were better discovered without an audience. The drive home from the lawyer's office felt like traveling through a time tunnel. Every street corner, every familiar landmark pulled me deeper into memories I had spent years trying to bury. As I sat in my car outside the house Robert and I had shared for 34 years, I couldn't help but remember the young woman I used to be. I was 24 when I met Robert Morrison at a company Christmas party in 1983. I had just finished my accounting degree and was working for a small firm downtown, full of dreams about building my own practice someday. Robert was 28, charming and ambitious, with calloused hands that told stories of hard work and eyes that promised a future. We married 8 months later in a small ceremony at St. Mary's Church. I wore my grandmother's dress, altered to fit my smaller frame, and carried wildflowers Robert had picked that morning from a field outside town. We couldn't afford much, but we were rich in hope. Brian was born 11 months after our wedding, a screaming, red-faced bundle of pure need. I remember holding him for the first time, overwhelmed by a love so fierce it almost frightened me. Robert cried when he first saw his son, and I promised myself I would do whatever it took to give this child everything I never had. That promise cost me more than I ever imagined. Robert's construction business was struggling in those early years. The recession of the early 80s had hit the building industry hard, and larger companies were undercutting his bids. Night after night, he would come home covered in dust and defeat, slumping at our kitchen table with unpaid bills spread before him like an accusation. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up, Ellie," he said one particularly dark evening when Brian was 3 years old. "Maybe I should just get a job working for someone else." I looked at my husband, at the dreams dying in his eyes, and made a decision that would define the rest of my life. "What if I helped?" I suggested quietly. What if I used my inheritance? My grandmother had left me $68,000, a fortune in 1986. It was meant to be my safety net, my independence, my chance to start my own accounting firm if Robert's business failed. It represented every sacrifice my grandmother had made, working as a seamstress for 50 years to leave something meaningful to her granddaughter. Robert's eyes lit up with possibility. Are you sure? That money was meant for you. We're married, I said, pushing aside the voice in my head that whispered warnings. What's mine is yours. I signed the papers the next week, transferring every penny to Morrison Construction. Robert bought new equipment, hired 2 workers, and began bidding on larger projects. Within 5 years, the company was thriving. Within 10 years, we were genuinely wealthy. But somewhere along the way, the we became he. Robert never asked my opinion about business decisions anymore. When clients complimented him on his success, he never mentioned my contribution. At dinner parties, he would joke about how lucky he was to have a wife who was content to stay home and take care of the family. I tried to return to work when Brian started kindergarten, but Robert was against it. Why would you want to work for someone else when I'm making enough for all of us? He asked, genuinely confused. Besides, Brian needs you here when he gets home from school. So I stayed home. I packed lunches and attended PTA meetings and organized birthday parties. I volunteered at the school library and coached Brian's Little League team when Robert was too busy with work. I became the perfect wife and mother, slowly erasing every dream I'd ever had for myself. Brian grew up believing this was normal. He saw a father who worked hard and a mother who existed to serve others. He never knew that I had sacrificed my grandmother's legacy to build his father's empire. He never knew that I had been offered a partnership at Brennan & Associates when he was 7, or that I had turned it down because Robert said it would be selfish to put my career ahead of my family's needs. By the time Brian turned 18, he had learned to see me the way Robert did, as someone whose value lay entirely in what I could do for others. When he brought girlfriends home, he would apologize for my old-fashioned ideas. When he went to college, he rarely called home, and when he did, he wanted to talk to his father about business, not to his mother about anything at all. Then he met Jessica. I knew she was trouble the moment she walked into our house during Brian's senior year at college. She was beautiful in that sharp, calculated way that comes from years of practice. Her smile never quite reached her eyes, and she had a talent for making cutting remarks sound like compliments. Mrs. Morrison, she said the first time we met, looking around our living room with barely concealed disdain. Your home is so cozy, very traditional. Brian beamed at her as if she had given me the highest praise. Mom loves her decorating shows, he said, as if my interest in making our home beautiful was some quaint hobby, rather than 20 years of creating a warm space for our family. Jessica nodded sympathetically. How nice that you have time for those little hobbies. Over the following months, I watched her systematically undermine every conversation I tried to have with Brian. If I mentioned a news story, she would redirect the discussion to something she considered more important. If I shared a memory from Brian's childhood, she would make a joke that painted me as an oversharing mother who couldn't let go of the past. The worst part was that Brian not only allowed it, he encouraged it. He laughed at her jokes at my expense. He chose her side in every small disagreement. He began treating me like an embarrassing relative, rather than the woman who had given up everything to ensure his success. When they announced their engagement, Jessica made it clear that she had big plans for modernizing the family. She suggested I might be more comfortable in a smaller place, since the big house would be too much work for someone my age. She talked about redecorating everything I had carefully chosen over the years, as if my taste was some outdated burden they had inherited. We want to start fresh, she explained to Robert and me over dinner. Create our own traditions. What she meant was, erase every trace of me. Robert, to his credit, initially resisted. Elaine has put a lot of love into this house, he said firmly. It's her home too. But Jessica was patient and persistent. She planted seeds of doubt slowly, carefully. She complained about how set in her ways I was. She made jokes about mother-in-law syndrome. She painted every attempt I made to maintain my place in my son's life as possessive and controlling. And Brian believed her. Or maybe he wanted to believe her, because it was easier than acknowledging what his success had cost me. The night before their wedding, I found myself alone in the kitchen, wrapping wedding favors that Jessica had decided were my responsibility. My hands moved automatically while my mind wandered to all the roads I hadn't taken, all the dreams I had surrendered. Robert found me there at 2 a.m, surrounded by ribbons and regret. "You're still up?" he asked, loosening his tie. He had been at Brian's bachelor party, though at 53 he was far too old for the festivities his son had planned. "Just finishing these," I said, gesturing to the favors. He sat down beside me, and for a moment we worked in comfortable silence. Then he said something that surprised me. "I've been thinking about your grandmother's money lately." I stopped wrapping, my hands frozen around a small silver box. "What about it?" "I never thanked you properly," he said quietly, "for giving it up, for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." Tears stung my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. "We were partners," I said simply. "Were," he repeated, and something in his voice made me look up. Past tense. I didn't know what to say to that. We both knew that somewhere along the way, our partnership had become my servitude. "Things are going to change after tomorrow," Robert said. And I thought he meant because Brian would be married, because our family dynamic would shift again. I had no idea he meant something else entirely. The first year of Brian and Jessica's marriage was like watching a slow-motion car accident. I could see the destruction coming, but I was powerless to stop it. They moved into the guest house on our property initially, while they looked for their own place. Jessica had insisted it was temporary, just until they could find something suitable for a young executive and his wife. But temporary stretched into months, and months stretched into a year, and I began to understand that this arrangement suited Jessica perfectly. She could play house in her own space while systematically dismantling my relationship with my son. It started with small things. Family dinners that I had hosted every Sunday for 15 years suddenly became too formal for their taste. Jessica preferred casual get-togethers that somehow never included me in the planning. When I offered to cook Brian's favorite meals, Jessica would sweetly suggest that maybe it was time for him to expand his palate beyond childhood comfort foods. "Mrs. Morrison," she said one evening when I had prepared pot roast, Brian's favorite since he was 8 years old. "You're so sweet to go to all this trouble, but Brian and I are really trying to eat healthier these days. All this heavy food." She patted her flat stomach meaningfully. Brian, who had been reaching for a second helping, withdrew his hand as if the food had suddenly become poisonous. "Mom always did cook pretty rich meals," he said apologetically to his wife, as if I weren't sitting right there. I watched my son choose Jessica's approval over his own preferences, and I felt something crack inside my chest. The holidays were worse. Jessica had traditions from her own family that she wanted to incorporate, which seemed to involve replacing everything meaningful to us with something that suited her better. Christmas morning, which had always been a quiet, intimate affair in our living room, became a catered brunch in the formal dining room with Jessica's parents and her sister's family. "It's so important for families to blend traditions," Jessica explained when I suggested we might alternate years or find a way to include both families' customs. "Don't you think it's time to try something new?" What she meant was, your traditions don't matter anymore. Jessica's mother, Patricia, was cut from the same cloth as her daughter, only with 30 years more practice at wielding sweetness like a weapon. She would compliment my cooking while suggesting improvements, praise my decorating while mentioning how dated certain pieces looked, and ask about my little hobbies, with just enough condescension to make it clear that my interests were quaint relics of a simpler time. "Elaine keeps herself so busy," Patricia would say to Robert at these gatherings, as if I weren't capable of speaking for myself. "It's wonderful how some women can find fulfillment in domestic pursuits." The implication was clear. Successful women like Jessica and Patricia had careers and ambitions. while women like me had recipe collections and garden clubs. Brian absorbed these subtle messages like a sponge. He began treating my opinions as outdated, my preferences as obstacles to overcome. When I suggested a family vacation to the lake house we had rented every summer for 20 years, Jessica wrinkled her nose and mentioned how rustic it was. How much nicer it would be to try somewhere more sophisticated. Maybe somewhere with a spa, she suggested brightly. Somewhere we could all relax and be pampered. Brian immediately agreed. That sounds amazing, Jess. Mom, you'd love a spa weekend, wouldn't you? I wanted to scream that I had never expressed any interest in spas, that what I loved was the simple cabin by the lake where Brian had learned to fish, and where Robert and I had spent quiet evenings reading on the porch. But Jessica was already pulling up resort websites on her phone, and Brian was leaning over her shoulder with enthusiasm, and I realized that my preferences had become irrelevant. The spa weekend was a disaster, at least for me. Jessica and Patricia spent their time getting massages and facials while making snide comments about women who let themselves go after a certain age. They spoke in codes that everyone understood but no one acknowledged directly. It's so important to take care of yourself, Jessica said, examining her manicured nails. Some women think that just because they're married, they can stop making an effort. She never looked at me when she said these things, but her meaning was unmistakable. Robert, oblivious to the undercurrents, spent the weekend golfing with Patricia's husband and seemed to think everyone was having a wonderful time. Brian was too focused on impressing his in-laws to notice that his mother was being systematically excluded from every conversation and activity. When we returned home, Jessica began making more aggressive moves. She started redecorating the main house, claiming that she was helping me update my outdated style. She replaced my grandmother's antique dining set with sleek modern furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine rather than a home. She painted over the soft blues and greens I had chosen with stark whites and grays that made the house feel cold and unwelcoming. It's so much more contemporary, she explained when I walked into my own living room and didn't recognize it. Don't you think it's time for a change? But the worst part wasn't the furniture or the paint. The worst part was watching my son become someone I didn't recognize. Brian had always been confident, but under Jessica's influence, his confidence curdled into arrogance. He began talking about people in terms of their value, dismissing anyone who didn't meet his new standards of success. He made jokes about small-town thinking and limited perspectives, as if the values Robert and I had taught him were embarrassing relics he had outgrown. When our neighbor, Mrs. Chen, brought over homemade cookies to welcome Jessica to the neighborhood, Brian accepted them politely enough, but later I heard him telling Jessica that it was sweet but kind of pathetic, how some people had nothing better to do than bake for strangers. She probably doesn't have much of a social life, Jessica agreed. It's sad, really. This from the woman who had never worked a day in her life and whose primary occupation seemed to be spending Brian's money and criticizing everyone around her. I tried to talk to Robert about what was happening, but he was dealing with his own struggles. The construction business was more demanding than ever, and he spent longer and longer hours at the office. When he came home, he wanted peace, not family drama. They're young, he would say when I expressed concern about Brian's changing attitude. They'll settle down. Jessica is poisoning him against us, I said one night after a particularly painful dinner where Brian had sided with his wife in criticizing my overcooking of the vegetables. Robert sighed heavily. Elaine, you're being dramatic. Jessica is just strong-willed. Brian will find his balance. But Brian wasn't finding balance. He was losing himself piece by piece, trading his authentic self for Jessica's approval. The breaking point came during the second year of their marriage, at my birthday dinner. I had asked for something simple, just family, just the four of us, at my favorite restaurant downtown. Jessica spent the entire meal complaining about the limited menu and the dated decor, making it clear that my choice of venue was yet another example of my poor judgment. When the waiter brought out the small birthday cake I had requested, Jessica looked at it with undisguised disdain. "Oh," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "How quaint." Brian laughed, actually laughed. Mom's not much for fancy desserts, he explained to his wife, as if my preferences were some charming character flaw. Well, Jessica said, cutting a tiny sliver for herself, I suppose some people are easily satisfied. I sat there, on my 59th birthday, listening to my son apologize for my existence to a woman who had never contributed anything meaningful to anyone's life, and I felt something die inside me. That night, as I lay in bed listening to Robert's steady breathing, I made a decision. I couldn't change Jessica. I couldn't change Brian, but I could change how much of myself I was willing to sacrifice on the altar of their approval. I began pulling back gradually. I stopped volunteering to cook for their dinner parties. I stopped offering to help with their social events. I stopped trying to insert myself into conversations where I clearly wasn't wanted. Jessica noticed immediately, of course. She began making comments about how distant I seemed, how unfriendly I was becoming. She told Brian that she was concerned about my withdrawal from family activities. Maybe your mother is going through something, she suggested with fake sympathy. You know how women can get at her age? The implication that my emotional health was declining, that my withdrawal was a sign of mental instability rather than self-preservation, was Jessica's masterstroke. Brian began looking at me with a mixture of pity and irritation, as if I were a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. When I overheard Jessica telling her mother that she was worried about my mood swings and antisocial behavior, I realized that she had successfully rewritten the narrative. In her version of events, I wasn't protecting myself from her constant criticism. I was becoming a difficult old woman who couldn't accept change, and Brian believed her. The final straw came when they announced they were buying their own house across town. I should have been relieved. Instead, I felt a profound sense of loss, because I knew this wasn't just them gaining independence. This was Jessica finally succeeding in removing me from my son's daily life entirely. We found the perfect place, Brian announced over dinner. 5 bedrooms, 3 baths, and Jessica loves the kitchen. That's wonderful, I said, and I meant it. You'll have room to grow. Jessica's smile was triumphant. Yes, we're really looking forward to having our own space, creating our own traditions. Without me. She didn't say it, but she didn't need to. Robert raised his wine glass. To new beginnings, he said. As I clinked my glass against theirs, I couldn't help but wonder what kind of ending this new beginning would bring. The envelope I handed to Mr. Whitman that morning contained more than just papers. It contained Robert's final attempt to set things right, and his acknowledgement of truths I thought he had never seen. 2 days before Robert died, he called me into his study. It was a Tuesday evening in March, and the spring rain was pattering against the windows like impatient fingers. He had been quieter than usual during dinner, pushing food around his plate while Jessica dominated the conversation with complaints about the country club's new policies. Ellie, he said, using the nickname he hadn't used in years, I need to talk to you. Something in his tone made me set down the book I had been reading. Robert was sitting behind his mahogany desk, the same one where he had written countless contracts and built his empire. But tonight, he looked smaller somehow, older than his 67 years. I've been thinking about a lot of things lately, he began, his fingers drumming nervously on the desk surface, about the business, about Brian, about us. I remained silent, sensing that this conversation had been building for longer than just this evening. I know what's been happening, he said quietly, with Jessica, with Brian. I've known for a long time. My heart stopped. Robert, He held up a hand to stop me. Let me finish, please. I nodded, my throat suddenly tight. I've been a fool, Elaine. A blind, selfish fool. His voice cracked slightly. I watched that woman systematically tear down everything you've built, everything you've given to this family, and I did nothing. Worse than nothing. I enabled it. Tears stung my eyes, but I blinked them back. After so many years of feeling invisible, of believing that Robert truly didn't see what was happening, his words felt like both vindication and heartbreak. I told myself it was normal adjustment, he continued. New wives, new dynamics, young people finding their way. But that wasn't what this was, and I knew it. He opened the desk drawer and pulled out a thick folder. "I've been documenting things, Ellie. For the past year." "Documenting what?" "Everything." His eyes met mine, and I saw pain there, deep and regretful. "The way Jessica talks to you when she thinks no one is listening. The way Brian dismisses you. The way they've been planning to ease you out of your own home." My blood ran cold. Planning what? Robert's jaw tightened. "Last month, I overheard Jessica on the phone with that interior designer of hers. She was discussing converting the master bedroom into a sophisticated retreat once you were no longer living here." The words hit me like a physical blow. "She said that?" "She said a lot of things." Robert opened the folder and spread several pages across the desk. "I started recording conversations, Elaine. I know it sounds extreme, but I needed proof of what I was seeing." I stared at the transcripts in disbelief. Page after page of conversations between Jessica and her friends, between Jessica and Brian, between Jessica and her mother. All discussing me like I was a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be removed. "Listen to this one," Robert said, pointing to a transcript dated 3 weeks earlier. "This is Jessica talking to her sister about our family dinner last Sunday." He read aloud, "She just sits there looking pathetic, like she's waiting for someone to acknowledge her. It's embarrassing, honestly. Brian knows it too, but he feels guilty. I keep telling him that guilt isn't love, and eventually he'll realize his mother is just unnecessary." The word unnecessary felt like a knife in my chest. All those years of sacrifice, of putting their needs before my own, and I had become unnecessary. "There's more," Robert said grimly. "Much more." He showed me transcripts of Jessica discussing my declining mental state with her friends, despite the fact that I had never shown any signs of mental decline. She had been building a narrative, painting me as a confused old woman who was becoming a burden on the family. "She's been very clever about it," Robert explained. "Never saying anything directly cruel, always couching her criticism in concern. But the pattern is clear. She's been systematically undermining your place in this family." I looked at another transcript, this one from a conversation between Jessica and Brian from just 2 weeks ago. "Jessica, your mother seems more withdrawn lately. I'm concerned about her isolation." Brian, "She's always been kind of needy. Maybe some distance is healthy." Jessica, "I just worry that she's becoming too dependent on us for emotional support. It's not healthy for any of us." Brian, "You're right. Maybe we should encourage her to find some activities, some friends her own age." Jessica, "Exactly. She needs to build a life that doesn't revolve around us." Reading my son's words, seeing how easily he had absorbed Jessica's poison, I felt something break inside me that I didn't think could ever be repaired. "But here's the worst part," Robert said, his voice heavy with anger. "Last week I found out they've been meeting with a realtor." "A realtor?" "They want to buy this house, Elaine. Our house. They've been having it appraised, discussing how to transition you out. Jessica told the realtor that you were getting too old to maintain such a large property, and that it would be easier for everyone if you moved to something smaller." The betrayal was so complete, so breathtaking in its cruelty, that I couldn't speak for several minutes. "They've been planning your erasure," Robert continued. "And they expected me to go along with it, expected me to help them push you out of your own life." "Why are you telling me this now?" I whispered. Robert's eyes filled with tears. "Because I'm dying, Elaine." The words hung in the air between us like a death sentence. "What?" The doctor confirmed it yesterday. "Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. 3 months, maybe 4 if I'm lucky." I felt the room spinning around me. "Robert, no. There must be something." "There isn't." His voice was calm, resigned. "I've known something was wrong for weeks. The fatigue, the weight loss. I just didn't want to face it." "We'll fight it," I said desperately. "We'll get second opinions, try experimental treatments. Ellie." His voice was gentle but firm. "It's too late for that. But it's not too late for me to do the right thing." He pulled out another document, this one bearing the letterhead of a different law firm. I've had a new will drawn up, one that Jessica and Brian don't know about. My hands trembled as I took the papers. The will was completely different from the one Mr. Whitman would read in 3 weeks. This one left everything to me, the house, the business, all of Robert's assets, everything. Robert, I can't. You can and you will. His voice was stronger now, more determined than I had heard it in years. That money you gave me 40 years ago? It didn't just save my business, Elaine. It built everything we have. You've been an equal partner in this marriage, even when I was too blind to see it. But Brian has shown me who he really is. Robert's face hardened. A man who would stand by and watch his wife destroy his mother isn't a man who deserves to inherit the fruits of that mother's sacrifice. He's still your son. And you're still my wife. The woman who gave up her dreams so I could chase mine. The woman who raised our son while I built my empire. The woman who deserves to be honored, not erased. I stared at the will through my tears. What do you want me to do with this? Keep it safe. If Brian shows the respect and love you deserve during my final months, we'll destroy it and go with the original will. But if he continues down this path, Robert's jaw set in a line I recognized from his business negotiations. If he continues to let Jessica poison him against you, then you give this to Mr. Patterson. He pointed to the name of the second law firm. He's been my friend for 30 years and he knows the whole truth. He'll make sure this will is executed properly. And the envelope I'm supposed to give Mr. Whitman? Robert smiled sadly. Insurance. A letter explaining everything, along with copies of the most damning transcripts. If Brian ever shows his true colors in public, if he ever humiliates you the way I've let him humiliate you in private, then you give Whitman that envelope. It will invalidate the first will and trigger the second one. I held the envelope against my chest, feeling the weight of Robert's final attempt to protect me. Why now? Why not sooner? Because I was a coward, he said simply. I was afraid of losing my son. I thought if I just waited, if I just hoped, he would come to his senses. But watching you disappear a little more each day, watching you become a ghost in your own home, I realized I was losing something far more precious. Robert, I love you, Elaine. I have always loved you. And I'm sorry it took me dying to find the courage to show it. We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of 40 years of marriage settling between us like a familiar blanket. Outside, the rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, washing the world clean. There's one more thing, Robert said finally. The business. I've restructured it so that you'll have complete control. Jessica has been hinting that Brian should take over when I'm gone. But Brian doesn't understand the first thing about construction. You do. You've been helping me with the books for 20 years. It was true. While Jessica had been redecorating and Brian had been climbing the corporate ladder at his finance job, I had been quietly managing the administrative side of Morrison Construction. I knew every contract, every client, every financial detail. You built this company as much as I did, Robert continued. It's time people knew that. That night, after Robert had hidden the new will in his private safe and given me the combination, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. In 3 months, I would be a widow, but for the first time in years, I wouldn't be powerless. I had no idea that 2 weeks later, Brian would give me the perfect opportunity to use Robert's final gift. I didn't return to the lawyer's office. Instead, I drove to Millfield Park, the same place where Robert had proposed to me 39 years earlier under the old oak tree that still stood sentinel beside the pond. I needed time to process what had just happened. What was about to happen? My phone rang incessantly during the 20-minute drive. First Brian, then Jessica, then several relatives who had witnessed the scene. I let every call go to voicemail. After 40 years of being available to everyone else, I finally had the luxury of being unavailable. At the park, I sat on the same wooden bench where Robert and I used to bring Brian when he was small. He would feed the ducks while we talked about our dreams, our fears, our hopes for his future. Never in those conversations did we imagine he would grow up to publicly humiliate the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister Margaret, who lived 3 states away. "Heard what happened from Cousin Tom. Are you okay?" I stared at the message, realizing that news of Brian's outburst was already spreading through our extended family. By evening, everyone would know that my son had called me a selfish witch and torn up what he thought was important legal documentation. They would also know what Mr. Whitman had read from Robert's real letter. I finally listened to my voicemails around 4 o'clock. The first few were exactly what I expected. Brian demanding to know what was in the envelope, Jessica's voice shrill with barely controlled panic, relatives asking if I was all right. But the fourth message made me smile for the first time in weeks. "Elaine, this is Tom." Robert's brother's voice was warm with something I hadn't heard in years: respect. "I just wanted to say that what happened today was long overdue. Robert was my brother, and I loved him, but he should have put a stop to this nonsense years ago. I'm glad he finally found his backbone, even if it was too late for him to use it while he was alive. That boy got exactly what he deserved, and so did that wife of his. Call me when you're ready to talk." The fifth message was from Robert's business partner, Frank Hendricks. "Elaine, Frank here. Just left the lawyer's office after discussing the business transition with Patterson. I want you to know that I'm behind you 100%. That company is as much yours as it was Robert's, and anyone who says different can go to hell. Looking forward to working with you as the new owner." The sixth message was the one that broke my heart and healed it at the same time. "Grandma Elaine?" The voice was tentative, young. It was David, Brian's 19-year-old son from his first marriage. A brief relationship in college that had ended amicably when both kids realized they were too young to make it work. David had lived with his mother in Portland, but he visited us every summer and had always been the bright spot in my relationship with Brian's family. "I heard what happened today. Dad called me, and he was pretty upset. But Grandma, I want you to know that I think Dad was way out of line. Like, completely wrong. I've seen how Jessica treats you, and I've wanted to say something for years, but I didn't think it was my place." His voice cracked slightly. "I love you, and I'm proud of Grandpa for standing up for you, even if he had to do it from, Anyway, I'm driving down from Portland tomorrow. I want to be there for you." I sat on that bench and cried for the first time since Robert's funeral. Not tears of sadness this time, but tears of relief. I wasn't as alone as I had thought. By the time I drove home that evening, 3 cars were parked in my driveway. Brian's BMW, Jessica's Mercedes, and a rental car I didn't recognize. Through the living room window, I could see silhouettes moving around, and I knew they were waiting for me. I sat in my car for a full 5 minutes, gathering my strength. Then I walked into my own house like I owned it, which, as of today, I finally did again. Brian pounced the moment I walked through the door. "Mom, what the hell was in that envelope?" "Hello to you too, Brian." I set my purse on the hall table and looked around the room. Jessica stood near the fireplace, her face pale and drawn. The rental car belonged to Jessica's parents, who sat stiffly on my sofa looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. "Don't play games with me," Brian snapped. "Whitman read Dad's letter, and now he's saying the original will is invalid. He's saying everything goes to you." "That's correct." I kept my voice calm, matter of fact. Jessica stepped forward, her hands clenched into fists. "This is ridiculous. Robert wouldn't have left everything to you. You don't know anything about running a business." I almost laughed. After 20 years of managing the books, handling client communications, and basically running the administrative side of Morrison Construction while she got her nails done, Jessica still believed I was nothing more than a housewife. "Your father's letter was very clear," I said to Brian. "He detailed his reasons for changing the will, including his disappointment in your behavior over the past several years." "What behavior?" Brian's voice cracked like an adolescent's. "I've been a good son. Have you?" I asked quietly. "When was the last time you asked how I was doing? When was the last time you stood up for me when your wife made one of her cutting remarks? When was the last time you treated me like a person instead of an obligation?" Brian's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. In the silence that followed, Jessica's mother, Patricia, spoke up. Elaine, surely we can work something out. Families should stick together during difficult times. The irony of Patricia lecturing me about family loyalty was almost too much to bear. This was the same woman who had spent years helping her daughter undermine my place in my own family. You're absolutely right, I said pleasantly. Families should stick together. They should support each other, respect each other, value each other's contributions. Thank you for reminding me of that. Jessica's face flushed red. You can't do this. You can't just steal everything we were supposed to inherit. Steal? The word came out sharper than I intended. Did you know, Jessica, that I gave up $68,000 of my inheritance to help Robert start his business? That was in 1986. Do you know what that money would be worth today? Jessica stared at me blankly. Over $300,000, I continued. That was my money, my grandmother's legacy, that built the foundation of everything Robert achieved. So tell me again about stealing. Brian sat down heavily in his father's favorite chair. Mom, I didn't know. There's a lot you didn't know, I interrupted, because you never asked. You never wondered why your father's business took off so suddenly in the late 80s. You never questioned how we could afford your private school tuition and your college education and your wedding gift of $50,000. You just assumed it all fell from the sky. That's not fair, Brian protested weakly. What's not fair, I said, my voice rising for the first time, is 40 years of being taken for granted. What's not fair is watching my daughter-in-law redecorate my home without asking my opinion. What's not fair is being treated like a burden in my own family. Jessica tried a different approach. Elaine, I know we've had our differences, but differences? I turned to face her fully. Is that what you call systematically trying to erase me from my son's life? Your husband recorded some of your conversations, Jessica. I know exactly what you think of me and what you've been planning. The color drained from Jessica's face. Recorded conversations? That's illegal. Actually, it's not. Not in this state. Not when they take place in his own home. I had done my research after Robert showed me the transcripts. And the recordings made it very clear that you've been planning to push me out of this house for quite some time. Patricia stood up abruptly. We should go, she said to her husband. This is a family matter. Yes, it is, I agreed. It's about time we started treating it like one. After Jessica's parents left, the three of us sat in uncomfortable silence. Finally, Brian spoke. What do you want from us, Mom? It was a reasonable question, and one I had been asking myself all afternoon. What did I want? I want you to think about the man your father was trying to raise, I said quietly. Not the man you've become, but the man he hoped you would be. The man who would honor his mother instead of humiliating her. The man who would see his wife's cruelty and put a stop to it instead of enabling it. Brian flinched as if I had slapped him. I want you to remember that your success didn't happen in a vacuum, I continued. Every opportunity you had, every advantage you enjoyed was built on sacrifices your father and I made, sacrifices you've never acknowledged. Jessica opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand to stop her. And I want you, I said, looking directly at her, to understand that your reign of terror in this family is over. You spent years trying to make me disappear, and now you have your wish. But I'm not disappearing into some sad little apartment where you can forget about me. I'm disappearing into a life where I'm valued and respected. What does that mean? Jessica asked suspiciously. I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in years. It means I'm done begging for scraps of affection from people who see me as disposable. It means I'm done making myself smaller to accommodate your comfort. And it means that if you want any kind of relationship with me going forward, you're going to have to earn it. Brian looked broken. Mom, I never meant... I know you didn't mean to hurt me, I said gently. But intent doesn't erase impact. The question now is what you're going to do about it. I stood up, suddenly exhausted by the emotional weight of the day. I'm going to bed. You two can see yourselves out. As I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, I heard Jessica hiss at Brian. We're not giving up. There has to be a way to contest this. But I wasn't worried about their legal challenges. Robert had been thorough, and Mr. Patterson was the best lawyer in the state. More importantly, I finally had something I hadn't possessed in years: the truth on my side and the power to enforce it. That night, I slept better than I had since Robert's diagnosis. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, I was finally the owner of my own life again. 6 months after that devastating day at the lawyer's office, I stood in the office that had once been Robert's, looking out at the construction site where Morrison Construction was building a women's shelter. The irony wasn't lost on me. A woman who had spent decades being systematically diminished was now using her newfound power to create safe spaces for other women escaping destructive situations. The business transition had been smoother than I'd expected. Frank Hendricks had been true to his word, supporting my leadership every step of the way. The crew had been skeptical at first. A 62-year-old woman taking over a construction company wasn't exactly conventional, but they quickly learned that I knew every aspect of the operation, from budgets to building codes to client relationships. "Mrs. Morrison?" My new assistant, Sandra, poked her head through the door. "Your grandson David is here for lunch." I smiled, closing the project folder I'd been reviewing. David had been my saving grace through all of this. After driving down from Portland the day after the will reading, he had stayed for 2 weeks, helping me navigate the legal complexities and offering emotional support when the weight of everything threatened to overwhelm me. He had also been the bridge I needed to understand just how toxic things had become from an outside perspective. "Grandma, I need to tell you something," he had said during his second day there, as we sat in the kitchen drinking coffee. "I've been watching this family dynamic for years, and it's been really hard to see." "What do you mean?" David had looked uncomfortable, running his hands through his sandy hair, so much like Brian's had been at that age. "Jessica has always been mean to you, like, really mean, but she does it in this way that makes it seem like she's being helpful or concerned." "I know, honey, but Dad," David's voice had cracked slightly. "Dad just lets it happen. Worse, he joins in sometimes. And I've wanted to say something for years, but I was afraid it would just make things harder for you." That conversation had been both heartbreaking and liberating. Knowing that someone else had witnessed the slow erosion of my dignity, that I hadn't been imagining or exaggerating the cruelty, had validated years of self-doubt. Now, 6 months later, David was finishing his sophomore year at Portland State, but made the drive down every few weeks to visit. He was studying business, and I had started teaching him about the construction industry. Unlike his father, David appreciated the stories behind the buildings, the relationships with clients, the satisfaction of creating something lasting. "How's the shelter project coming along?" he asked as we walked to our favorite lunch spot, a small cafe downtown that served the kind of simple, honest food Jessica had always disdained. "We're ahead of schedule and under budget," I said proudly. "The women's advocacy group is thrilled. They've never had a contractor who actually listened to what they needed instead of telling them what they should want." David grinned. "That's because you've been on the other side of not being heard." It was true. Working with the advocacy group had been a revelation. These women understood exactly what it felt like to have your voice dismissed, your needs minimized, your worth questioned. We spoke the same language of resilience and quiet strength. "Have you heard from Dad lately?" David asked carefully. We had developed an unspoken agreement that he could ask about Brian, but I wouldn't burden him with the messy details of our fractured relationship. "He calls sometimes," I said honestly, "usually when Jessica isn't around." That was the most painful part of the whole situation. In quiet moments, when his wife wasn't there to influence him, Brian would call me. He would ask how I was doing, tell me about work, even share memories from his childhood. But the moment Jessica returned, he would retreat back into the cold distance that had become our normal dynamic. "I think he's starting to see things differently," David said hopefully. I sighed, stirring my soup thoughtfully. "Maybe, but seeing and acting are two different things. Your father has spent years choosing Jessica's approval over my feelings. I can't keep hoping he'll suddenly find the courage to change." It was a hard truth, but one I had finally accepted. I could love Brian without accepting his behavior. I could hope for better while protecting myself from further disappointment. What about Jessica? Does she ever call? I laughed, but there was no bitterness in it anymore. Jessica is focused on damage control. She's convinced that if she can just find the right legal loophole or emotional manipulation, she can still get what she feels entitled to. What Jessica didn't understand was that Robert's planning had been meticulous. Every possible challenge had been anticipated and addressed. More importantly, the recorded conversations Robert had documented created an ironclad case for his decision to change the will. She's hired 3 different lawyers, I continued. Each one has told her the same thing. The will is uncontestable, but she can't accept that her actions have consequences. The hardest part hadn't been the legal battles or even the family drama. The hardest part had been learning to live without the constant weight of other people's expectations. For 40 years, I had defined myself by how well I served others. Now, at 62, I was learning who I was when I wasn't trying to please everyone else. I have something to tell you, David said, his expression turning serious. I'm transferring schools to the university here. I want to finish my degree locally. My heart skipped. David, you don't need to. It's not about obligation, Grandma. It's about choice. I love spending time with you. I love learning about the business. And honestly, being around Dad and Jessica has become really uncomfortable. They're always complaining about you or plotting ways to get money from you, and I'm tired of listening to it. The relief I felt was overwhelming. I had been so afraid that my conflict with Brian would cost me my relationship with David, the one person in the family who had never asked me to be smaller than I was. Besides, David continued with a grin, someone needs to learn how to run Morrison Construction when you're ready to retire. I'm not retiring anytime soon, I protested, but the idea warmed me. Having someone to share the business with, someone who appreciated its history and understood its values, felt like a gift I had never dared to hope for. That afternoon, as David and I toured the construction site for the women's shelter, my phone rang. Brian's name appeared on the screen, and for the first time in months, I answered. Hi, Mom. His voice was subdued, different somehow. Hello, Brian. I was wondering, would it be okay if I came by this evening, alone? I have some things I need to say to you. I looked at David, who nodded encouragingly. All right, come around 7. When Brian arrived that evening, he looked older than his 38 years. The arrogance that had defined him for so long had been replaced by something that looked like humility, though I wasn't sure yet if it was genuine or simply another manipulation tactic. Mom, I need to apologize, he began as soon as he sat down in the living room. Not just for what happened at the lawyer's office, but for everything. For years of taking you for granted. For letting Jessica treat you the way she has. For forgetting that you're my mother, not my enemy. I remained silent, waiting to see if this was the beginning of real accountability or just another attempt to manipulate me into giving him what he wanted. I've been thinking about what you said, he continued, about the man Dad was trying to raise versus the man I became, and you're right. I became someone I don't like very much. What changed? I asked quietly. Brian ran his hands through his hair, a gesture that reminded me painfully of the little boy he used to be. Jessica filed for divorce 2 weeks ago. I felt a complex mix of emotions. Sadness for Brian's pain, relief that Jessica's influence might finally be ending, and hope that maybe my son could find his way back to himself. I'm sorry, I said, and I meant it. Despite everything Jessica had done to me, I took no joy in seeing Brian hurt. The thing is, Brian continued, when she left, she took everything she could carry and cleaned out our joint bank accounts. And she told me exactly what she thought of me, of our marriage, of you. He looked up at me with eyes that were red-rimmed and raw. She said I was weak for letting you manipulate Dad into changing the will. She said she never loved me, just what she thought I could provide for her. And she said that you were a bitter old woman who would die alone because nobody could stand to be around you. The words stung, even coming secondhand, But what surprised me was Brian's reaction to them. And when she said that last part, Brian said, his voice breaking, I realized that the bitter old woman she was describing wasn't you at all. It was her. You're not bitter, Mom. You're just tired. Tired of being treated badly by people who should love you. I felt tears pricking my eyes, but I blinked them back. This was the most honest conversation Brian and I had had in years, maybe decades. I can't undo the damage I've done, he continued. I can't take back the years of choosing her over you, of letting her poison me against the woman who sacrificed everything for my happiness. But I want to try to make things right, if you'll let me. What does that look like? I asked. I don't know yet, Brian admitted. Maybe it starts with me accepting that you don't owe me anything, that if you never want to see me again, I've earned that. But I hope maybe someday you might be willing to let me try to be the son you deserved all along. I looked at this broken man sitting in my living room, and I saw glimpses of the boy I had raised, the one who used to help me bake cookies and tell me about his dreams. That boy was still there, underneath 40 years of poor choices and toxic influences. Brian, I said finally, I never stopped loving you. I just stopped accepting unacceptable behavior. If you're serious about change, if you're willing to do the work of rebuilding trust, then yes, we can try. The relief on his face was profound. Thank you, he whispered. I won't let you down again. You might, I said honestly. Change is hard, and old patterns die slowly, but I'm willing to give you the chance to prove me wrong. 6 months later, Brian was still working on himself. He had started therapy, taken a hard look at his values and priorities, and begun the slow process of rebuilding his relationship with David. We talked regularly now, and while trust was still fragile, respect was gradually returning. I never did move out of the house on Elm Street. Instead, I renovated it, stripping away Jessica's cold modernization and restoring the warmth that had made it a home. David moved into the guest house after transferring schools, and together we built the kind of family Robert and I had always dreamed of, one based on mutual respect rather than obligation. Morrison Construction continued to thrive under my leadership. We specialized in projects that mattered: affordable housing, community centers, spaces that brought people together rather than dividing them. Every building we constructed carried a piece of my story, a testament to the truth that it's never too late to rebuild your life on your own terms. As for Jessica, I heard through the family grapevine that she had moved back in with her parents and was dating a married businessman 20 years older than herself. I felt no satisfaction in her downfall, only gratitude that her chapter in our family's story was finally closed. Standing in my garden that first spring after Robert's death, planting the flowers I had always loved but Jessica had deemed too common, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. I had lost a husband, nearly lost a son, and discovered strength I never knew I possessed. At 63, I was finally living the life I had always deserved, one where my voice mattered, my contributions were valued, and my happiness was not contingent on making myself smaller for other people's comfort. It had taken 6 decades, but I had finally learned the most important lesson of all. The only approval I truly needed was my own. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.